good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everyone. My name is Lauren Sorkin, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Global Resilient Cities Network to our 15th Speakers Series, Sharing Knowledge to Respond to the Coronavirus with Resilience. We have a fantastic lineup tonight to talk about resilient food systems. And before I turn the microphone over to Francis from the World Bank, our co-hosts, to introduce our speakers, I just want to remind everyone of the purpose of these sessions and a few quick ground rules. These sessions are convened for cities and partners who are supporting them to respond and recover from the coronavirus. These are practitioner, open, honest conversations, and they are not formally on the record. So if you do want to publish any of the information that our speakers are sharing tonight, we simply ask that you reach out to us and we will put you in touch with them to get their permission. Also, we are thrilled. We have over 400 people who have registered to listen in tonight from all around the world. We will be using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screens, to capture questions. So please do enter your questions there. You can use the chat function if you want to say hello and introduce yourself if you're on the line. Last, I would also mention that this week we'll be introducing some polling. So please respond in those polls and we will share the results with you when we conclude the presentations and move on to the Q&A. And with that, I just want to thank you for being here with us and turn the microphone over to Francis.
Thank you, Lauren. Welcome everybody on behalf of the World Bank City Resilience Program. My name is Francis Guesquer. I'm the practice manager for urban and disaster risk management for the World Bank in the East Asia region. So today's session will look at food systems and COVID-19. We'll have three speakers. We'll start with David Jácome Polit, who's a CRO in Quito. He'll give us a little bit of a deep dive on the issues faced by the city. Danielle Nierenberg, who's the president of Food Tank, will share some reflection on how to reset the food systems in the context and as a result of COVID-19. And finally, Roy Steiner, who's a senior vice president at the Rockefeller Foundation, working on the food initiative of the Rockefeller Foundation, will share some reflection. They'll speak for about 35-40 minutes as usual. We will then, as is now tradition, share some of the cartoons prepared by our cartoonists, friends, and open for Q&A. I hope you enjoyed today's talk. Let me pass the screen to David, who will get us started. David, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen now. You can see it. My presentation today is about urban development, food insecurity, and how these two aspects are either hindering or helping the city's capacities to face the coronavirus pandemic. And we start with Ecuador. We have until a couple of days ago a little bit over 36,000 cases, confirmed cases. 55% of these cases are mostly men. Around 5,000 cases are located in Pichincha, 4,500 cases in Quito. And what we have here is a map where you can see where most of the cases are located, concentrated, especially in the parishes in the north and in the south part of Quito. 200 plus cases are the parishes with a red color, and 100 plus cases the parishes with the orange color. But this is not the only problem. The thing is that these parishes also have other issues around it. We have a high concentration of houses in risk situations. Large percentage of people who doesn't have access to the public social security system, large number of, or percentage of single mothers, a very low number of square meters per person of green space. And although Quito is a pretty well-served city, these parishes have a certain percentage of people who doesn't have access to public services. In the case of Calderon, for example, around 15% of the people doesn't have access to public services. So this already sets a challenging scenario. And if we compare these numbers with how food insecurity is distributed in the city, what we have here in these two maps are concentrations of people who doesn't have their basic needs covered. That is the map on the left, as compared to the offer of food. And as you can see there in the north or in the south, you have most of the concentration of vulnerable population. But also on the map on the right, you will see that we have children with chronic undernutrition or disnutrition also concentrated in both parts of the city. So all these different aspects go hand in hand, of course, but also they make it difficult for the city and the municipality of Quito to respond to the pandemic. So as a way to respond, we've been working on food issues in the city of Quito since 2016, and I would say even before that, because the urban farming program of the city of Quito has already around 15 years. But we identified that we have a very weak economy and that we should strengthen that by approaching or by strengthening the food system of the city, especially when we have a possible population dividend, which means that we have half of the population which is quite young. And one of the contributions of 100 resilient cities to the city of Quito was EY's productive sectors assessment. And one of the sectors that is able to provide quality jobs, especially for women and for youngsters, is actually the food sector. At the same time, in 2017, the Agri-Food Pact of the city of Quito was conformed. 24 organizations and around 1.6 thousand people signed the Agri-Food Letter, which basically sets a common goal for all these different actors of the agri-food system. In 2018, we launched the agri-food strategy of the city of Quito and asked us to set up a risk mitigation plan for the whole food system in the city. At the same time, implementing the resilience strategy of the city of Quito, we worked into neighborhood development plans under a resilience lens, under a citizen participation program, and a program to reduce the physical vulnerability of buildings also as a way to engage with people. They are both contributing to reducing food insecurity in the city. In 2019, we decided to start working in the agri-food resilience strategy of the city of Quito, which allows us to better understand how food insecurity is working in the city, but also how the whole food system works. At the same time, the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact provided funds to the city of Quito to see how certain factors or indicators can be measured. And we've been working on that as well. So as a result, we want to change the way we are producing food. We want to spark innovation by putting together food clusters. We want to conform food hubs in the city so that food can be available, especially for the most vulnerable. We want to increase food literacy among the population so that they know to choose better their diets. And we want to actually start building a food circular economy scheme in the city, because we are basically in zero in that sense. For 2020, all these different strategies are going to be embedded in the development plan of the city and the land use plan of the city. And we are working into starting the food hub study of everything that I just mentioned. And this is all connected. When we analyzed the food insecurity of the city, we used the concept of food security from the FAO. And what we did is we broke down the whole concept into these different factors. We have 4 domains and around 38 factors. You see some of our findings on the left side below in the screen. But the interesting thing is that we are able to monitor right now how, for example, the pandemic is hitting all these different factors in the city. What is working to help us face the emergency, but also what is getting worse. So, for example, economically, people are having more difficulties to access food. And when it comes to physically accessing food as well, the inadequate urban development of the city is being has presented some challenges to access food. Also, the efficient transport system. But for example, urban farming has been quite helped. I will mention this later. And organizing the small shops in neighborhoods, the distribution through retailers also has been helping. The food bank has been quite active in providing food, and also a Patronato San Jose. But we also know that there is a problem when it comes to people's choices of food, because some of them, for starters, they don't know how to cook, and their diets are poor, and some of the food offered is already unsafe. And finally, one of the main things that we are looking at right now is that we have a pretty weak food management system when it comes to emergencies. So there are certain things that we already know that we need to work on and improve, and some other things that we know that are working and that they need to be strengthened. As part of the plan, as a way to look at all these factors in a more organized way, we understand that they should be looked at different scales, and we categorize them within the different food chain links. So we know what works in a certain scale and what works in larger scales. For example, food hubs is something that we need to work at a metropolitan level. But then neighborhood organization or urban farming, of course, they work at a neighborhood level. That helps us to organize planning and policy making, but also organize the help that we are providing. And one of the consensus that we reached when we started to plan for all these interventions is that everything needs to be done under a gender lens. It has to be highly participatory. We need to connect better production to consumption. We need to reduce the amount of waste that is produced while we are producing and consuming food, and that we need to be smarter when it comes to managing physical infrastructure of the city. As a result, like I was mentioning, what is working properly right now for the city of Quito are, for example, the urban farms. We have 1.6 farms that are producing organic and local food. Until last measure that we did was a couple of weeks ago, 1.35 million kilograms of food was produced. 57% was for self-consumption, for citizens, and 43% was sold. But on top of that, we were able to provide 11 tons per week of food distributed among the most vulnerable, which basically means that people producing food in the city that are quite vulnerable were helping other vulnerable people only by producing within the city's limits. And the other great example is the food bank of the city of Quito, which has been able to organize and to articulate with different actors in the food of the food system, providing over 230,000 kilograms of food to more than 100 people that is vulnerable. And this is possible to make it more efficient. Because since 2016, we started building the risk index of the city, which allows us to understand how vulnerable population is distributed in and around the city. So what you have here is a map with gray color showing us where this population is distributed. We know where they are located by parish or by administrative zones, which are basically larger areas. But we also know what kind of group they belong to, either single mothers, migrants, of course, including our brothers and sisters from Venezuela that we have here in the city, disabled elders. And we know that we have a little bit over 260,000 people that we need to help between poor and urban poor. And we know at a certain level where they are located. But I was mentioning before, the citizen participation program of the city of Quito has also provided us with additional opportunities to help the most needed. And that is where when we connect with neighborhood leaders in neighborhoods, because the data that we have doesn't allow us to go in such a small scales. So these leaders, they already know who needs better assistance, and they've been showing us where they are located. You can see that on the red dots, how they are concentrated. You can see that on the map on the right. And they've been helping us to quantify in an exact way the kind of help that is needed. They have helped us to identify people who has special needs, such as non-speaking people or people with additional diseases that doesn't allow them to leave home, for example. They've been quite helpful to help us organize the systems provided inside neighborhoods, but also to communicate inwards the efforts coming from the local government, the municipality of Quito, or the central government. And just as a summary, I can say that there is still a lot of things that need to be improved in the city of Quito. Better coordination among different levels of government and in a horizontal way between agencies in the municipality of Quito, but also better coordination with other stakeholders, especially the private ones, companies and so on. We have been adjusting interventions in the territory as we move forward, helping these people during the pandemic and during the emergency. That is mainly because the lack of information that we have. And we also acknowledge that not every neighborhood leader or neighborhoods are equally prepared to cooperate. And that is true. That means that we need to strengthen the citizen participation program of the city. But we also know that we can reach out for the most needed and to make sure that no one is left behind if we work properly. That we can build social support and trust to voluntarily comply with the required measures, although this has been increasingly difficult during these days, since people are less eager to stay indoors, and the city and the central government has been impelled to already open economic activities. We've been able to test in place regulations for risk response and understand also what is missing and what we need to include or strengthen. We can be better prepared and recovery programs after the pandemic, which is something that we are working on right now. And as a result, we can also be better prepared to face other different challenges in the future. But if we went from theory to practice, which is basically what we have been working on, putting together the resilience strategy of the agri-food system of the city, we understand that systems thinking is critical to address complex challenges, as you all saw, the multi-scale chart that I just showed. That is not possible with these kind of skills were not part of the working team. And that we need to plan cities as complex systems, since they are complicated and complex at the same time. And also, resilience is recognized as a property of a complex system. That is what we are trying to build here with this plan. And finally, that if the resilience of a system depends on how well the system works before a crisis, then we cannot build resilience if we are not able to provide better livelihoods and quality of life to our citizens, meaning that everyone should be included. And everyone should have, in this case, access to food, or in this case, access to be safe from the pandemic. And at the same time, we must make sure that we have to prepare for and to overcome events that may threaten the safety of people, and also make sure that the different functions of the city continue during and after an emergency. And as a final thing, I would like just to say that this is not an effort of one single agency in the city of Quito. It is the result of a pretty large team. Most of the names are already on my screen, and we are very thankful for that. But also the coordination among different organizations, starting GRCN, of course, but also the RAP Foundation and Quito, who have been very supportive with the city of Quito to strengthen the agri-food system of the city. Thank you very much, and I would be glad to take any questions.
David, and we're going to open it up to Danny now to continue with the presentations, and then we'll come back for our questions. So I'm going to turn it over now to one of the first people who helped me to understand the incredible impacts of the food system and how we can really make a difference in choosing not only what we eat, but how we talk about what we eat. And so with that, I will turn it over to you, Danny. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, and good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. I am really honored to be part of this discussion, and I want to thank David, Roy, Francis, Lauren, and the Global Platform for Sustainable Cities. These conversations and really blunt dialogues need to happen more and more as we navigate not just COVID-19, but systemic racism and inequality across the globe, and future global shocks that will result from climate change. David is a pretty hard act to follow, but I want to share some of the things that I and my organization, Food Tank, have been thinking about since March when the pandemic first began. So if you can share the first slide, Nini, that would be really helpful. Thank you so much. So we co-founded Food Tank, my co-founder Bernard Pollock and I, with this mission of really highlighting stories of hope and success in the food system, both in the United States and internationally. And we feel that part of our job is really to amplify the good work being done by organizations and individuals all over the world to fix the food system and make it more environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable. Since the lockdown began, my coping mechanism has been to listen. Usually I'm traveling to somewhere like Dakar or Des Moines to hear from farmers, chefs, or policymakers about how to fix a food system that I and many others have called broken. So now I video conference with experts like yourselves every day, at least twice a day on foodtank.com, about how COVID-19 and other things are really transforming and disrupting our food system. From the stories that the experts that I'm talking to share, it's clear that agriculture needed to be revolutionized pre-pandemic, and that we can't return to the way things were after the pandemic. The unprecedented challenges that we're seeing unfolding as a result of COVID-19 and systemic racism really also provide enormous opportunities to create and transform a food system, transform it into something that can't be broken, that is truly regenerative and restorative, and that leaves no one behind. And the work of cities and many parts of the world, as David outlined, will be critical to creating that new vision of what nutrition, health, and agricultural sustainability look like. So the first thing I want to talk about is the role of technology. And one of the things that I've been so impressed by is how cities and organizations within cities are changing practices as a result of the pandemic through combining high and low tech innovations. As farmers markets and restaurants closed, many farmers were left without outlets to sell their food, and digital technology is really making it possible to change the way they do business. In Minnesota, for example, we talked to the Mill City Farmers Market. They set up an online store for customers to choose products from individual farms and then pick them up via a drive-through market. And these drive-through markets have evolved immensely since March, with more sellers, less cars, and more bikes and folks walking and keeping a lot of social distancing. My own farmers market in Fells Point in Baltimore in Maryland has instituted touchless pay systems and keeping both buyers and sellers at a really healthy distance so that they can have some social interaction, but also keep people safely apart. And I think that interaction is something we're all really craving right now, especially from the people who produce our food. Community-supported agriculture or subscription boxes have risen tremendously in popularity and are delivering straight from the farm to the door of many consumers, helping urban residents really feel more secure about their food supply. And when I spoke to the National Young Farmers Coalition and the Glenwood Center for Regional Food and Farming a few months ago, they were connecting with one another over Zoom meetings, like so many of us are, to provide advice on food safety for farmers and farmers markets. Old-fashioned phone trees were being set up so that farmers can share resources or simply check in on one another. And one thing that makes me feel really hopeful is the camaraderie that has developed among younger and elder farmers. There's more mentorship taking place, as well as young farmers doing things like driving products for older farmers into cities so that those older farmers are less exposed to the virus. For clients who depend on things like SNAP or food stamps here in the United States, the organization Wholesome Wave has been piloting an online system in Connecticut cities to deliver essential food to clients, allowing them to order food from their cell phones. Pandemic or not, allowing SNAP clients to access food just as easily as so many of us do through ordering will be a game changer, especially for parents and the elderly. I'm also been, impressed by how companies like Aero Farms and Gotham Greens in New Jersey and New York are producing food using aquaponics to get fresh foods in the hands of consumers, even as grocery store shelves continue to lack fresh produce. So they're really filling a shortage that continues to happen. In addition, Food Tank has been part of what is called the Refresh Working Group. And this is a group of folks originally led by Google, but it brings together farmers and entrepreneurs and innovators and technology companies to really discuss the challenges and opportunities that technology has for the food system right now. Technology is not a silver bullet, as we all know, but it can help both producers and eaters navigate at a really uncertain time in the food system and help us develop better tools and strategies and create better access and affordability, as well as improving urban agriculture, which I think will become more and more important in the future. The second thing I want to emphasize is how important it has been to make those that have been invisible to many of us visible. It's no secret that the folks who harvest, slaughter, process, prepare, distribute, sell, and serve our food are really putting their lives at risk wherever we live, whether we live in a city or a town or out in the country. Their essentialness is something that can no longer be denied, nor can the unfair and unjust labor practices and low wages that make them vulnerable every day in the workplace. Saru Jayaraman of One Fair Wage hopes that when the restaurant industry emerges, it can actually take care of its people and allow both employers and workers to thrive. That will mean better salaries, including things like a $15 minimum wage and universal unemployment insurance. Saru's work has long focused on folks who are literally behind kitchen doors, servers, cooks, wait staff, and others who, because of their immigration status or the color of their skin, routinely face discrimination harassment, including sexual harassment and other types of abuse. Millions and millions of these workers, these restaurant workers and food workers, are now out of jobs, and because they were making so much, their wages were so low in the first place, many of them can't file for unemployment, and many can't file for unemployment because they're scared that it will disrupt their status in this country right now. So these are real issues that can no longer be ignored wherever we live. Eaters can no longer ignore farm workers as well. Their ability to maintain good health and be safe ensures all of us as eaters are safe, whether they're picking tomatoes in Florida, cucumbers in Ohio, or organic lettuce in California. They need the protection that comes through organizing and collective action. I spoke with Baldomor Velasquez, who is the president of the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, earlier this week, and he emphasized how boycotts always work. When urban consumers and rural farmers and farm workers can work together, that is where real power and change can happen. And along those same lines, some companies who depend on food and farm workers are also stepping up, while others, unfortunately, are regressing and suppressing workers' rights. Hazard pay or hero pay was initially implemented by companies like Stonyfield Organic, Farmer's Fridge, Purdue Farms, while at the same time Trader Joe's, a big grocery store chain here in the United States, are actively thwarting the rights of workers to form unions. These actions, I think, will ultimately impact consumers' decisions over the long run. Urban consumers have a lot of influence and power, and Mark Perrone, the president of the United Food and Commercial Workers, like Baltimore, believes that urban consumers have a tremendous amount of power with their food dollars to make change, and that we can no longer unsee the cracks and the dangers in our current food system, especially for workers. The next thing that I'm kind of excited about is the role of food as medicine and how important that's become during this time. And it's particularly important, I think, for urban eaters. According to the Centers for Disease Control here in the United States, people with diet-related diseases, including things like diabetes, obesity, and hypertension, are at higher risk for severe COVID-19 infection. African-American communities in the United States have been devastated by the infection, with both high rates of infection and mortality. We had the opportunity to talk to former U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Dan Glickman, and he is someone who believes our diets can help flatten the curve of COVID-19. He says what you eat has a lot to do with how healthy you are, and eating plenty of fruits and vegetables and getting enough things like zinc and vitamin D can help ward off disease. I think the most important point that he made during our discussion is that we need farm diversity. Farmers need the flexibility to grow fruits and vegetables rather than monoculture crops. And David mentioned this idea of food literacy and food as medicine, and increasing diversity, I think, are really important parts of increasing that food literacy. The kind of diversity that Dave Glickman talked about can also come from urban farms. And one that I like very much is Rise and Root Farm in the Bronx of New York. Karen Washington, who has led that farm, has used it to not only feed folks in the community, but also empower young Black people and members of the LGBTQ+ community by teaching them leadership skills and giving them confidence. To not only become farmers, but to take leadership over their own lives and really empower themselves. Similarly, Harlem Grown, which is run by Tony Hillary, is working to feed homeless students and their families healthy and delicious meals that come from still running school gardens in Harlem that Tony and his team maintain. We all know that the shutdowns of schools, while very necessary, have meant that lots of kids are going hungry around the globe. According to the World Food Program, 360 million kids have lost access to school meal programs around the world. And I recently had the opportunity to speak to Devin Clitell from the Rockefeller Foundation and Katie Wilson of the Urban School Food Alliance about how when schools closed, school cafeterias didn't have to remain open, but so many have, and they're really changing distribution models for providing meals to kids. At first, school cafeterias started serving individual meals curbside so that folks could pick them up. But now many are providing a week's worth of food to families so that students and their parents and their siblings can have enough to eat. Schools are doing this really out of the goodness of their heart without the promise of reimbursement from the federal government. But they're doing it anyway. And I find that so heroic. Devin said that the hard truth is that while many of us thought kids would be saved from the health impacts of COVID-19, now so many are at risk for food insecurity. And while philanthropy can provide resources over the short term and a lot of support, federal, state, and city governments will also need to step up to the plate to make sure that schools can continue serving those meals and making sure that kids are well fed as well as their families. Can we show my final slide, please? So I think the final thing that I want to talk about is really expanding this definition of resilience and what it means, not just for cities, but I think our overall social, economic, and environmental systems. In January, which seems like a million years ago to me now, Food Tank held a summit in partnership with the Sweetie Center for Sustainable Food Systems in Tucson, Arizona. And it focused on the theme of the wisdom of indigenous foodways and the need for listening to native voices in the food system. The room was filled with about 400 folks from tribes and native communities from all over North America and Hawaii. And it was so inspiring to hear what they've been doing. Conversations about indigenous food systems frequently feature rampant poverty, obesity, impoverished conditions on reservations, and lack of food access. And while all of this is true, these conversations really overshadow the incredible success stories that are happening. And the summit was really, I think, so inspiring because it elevated these stories and it helped us all sort of learn from what those communities are doing, what Native communities have been doing for a long time. We partnered with Kathleen Merrigan, the former U.S. Deputy Secretary of Agriculture, on the event. She's now the head of the Sweetie Center. And she said that diversity is lacking in a lot of our food system work. If we're going to change the way we do food in this country, we need to change the faces around the decision makers so that they reflect the real demographics of this country. And I think these words have never been more true. COVID-19 shows us how fragile our food, social, and economic systems are, but I think we have an amazing opportunity and a responsibility to now reset what the food system looks like. To fight the pandemic and improve the food system and social justice, we need to reimagine how we grow and eat food and how we mobilize for change. The resilience of cities is also dependent on finding ways to promote, create, and maintain equality and fight against racism and discrimination. The uprisings that are happening all over the country, including Baltimore, where I live, and across the globe, are really calling for an end to systemic racism and are so inspiring. And I don't think that could have happened in such a powerful way without the pandemic. I don't think the demonstrations themselves are just about police violence, brutality, and cruelty. They are about confronting and dismantling racism and inequity in all of its forms. And Food Tank's jobs and all of our jobs right now are really to amplify the voices that need to be heard, that haven't been heard, and that have a real voice to change the way we eat and produce food. So I think I'll end there. Again, it was such an honor to be part of this discussion. I will look forward to Roy's remarks and any questions that people have. And thanks again for including me.
Great. So should I just jump in here, Lauren?
Yes, absolutely. Go right ahead.
Great. Thank you so much, David and Danny. I mean, I have only three reflections, which really reinforce what you said. I really do think that COVID has made that the invisible visible. I mean, we have incredible inequality and racism in our food system, and I think this is providing us with really a dress rehearsal for all the upcoming stresses and shocks we're going to face, not just from future pandemics, but from climate change, et cetera. So this is an opportunity for us to rethink and rebuild that really has not, that we need to take advantage of. I think it's actually also important to recognize, COVID started because of a food choice. Someone made a decision to eat something in Wuhan, China, sometime in late 2019, and 5 months later, the entire global economy has shut down. And it just shows how interconnected and interdependent we are. And and that speaks to David's point that we really need to think more in terms of systems and interconnection and interdependence, and understand the implications of that. So that's one thought. The second is, it is remarkable that if we actually had healthy, protective diets, COVID would just not be as big an issue. 80% of the people, as Danny said, had underlying diet-related chronic diseases, right? 80%. Like, imagine if we just didn't have 80% of the hospitalizations, COVID would not be an issue. And it's fundamentally because we have really crappy diets and we're promoting food that we know is unhealthy, and we've created structures and subsidies and entire systems that we know are not benefiting human beings. And we got to redo this. It doesn't make sense on any level, moral, economic, socially. And then the third idea around, I think both David and Danny talked about resilience, and I think there's so many elements that we need to work on, especially around shortening, improving the connection between urban and rural areas. We have way too much in many parts of the world, not all. We have way too much concentration in the food system that makes it very brittle. We've designed it for hyper efficiency, and there's obviously a trade-off with resilience there. We need to go back and redesign with different objective functions. So I think there's some real opportunities there. And then let me just finish. We're doing a lot of work in Africa right now, and what was so interesting was during this crisis, an immediate reaction by many governments was to shut down the fresh markets. And this had just incredible negative impact on not just the fact that 95% of nutritious food actually comes through these fresh markets in African cities, but then all these farmers, small, medium farmers, had no place to put their product. And the economic consequences of people who have so little money and there's no safety net in place was really tragic. And so, we've spent a lot of time figuring out how do you keep those markets going. And we think there's a way to redesign smart markets that really leverage technology, that leverage solar energy, that leverage all these things that we know can be done to kind of build in infrastructure that's going to be a lot more resilient. So let me stop there and hand it back to Lauren and Francis.
Thank you, Roy, and thank you again, Danny and David. We did have a short poll, and I just wanted to let everyone know, we asked all of the participants as they were watching and listening, what did they think would be the potentially most interesting solution for cities coming out of the pandemic to strengthen the food systems in their cities. And the top one we heard about was urban farming. And that's pretty consistent as well with a number of the questions that have come up. So I'm going to pose the question, and then I actually am going to turn it to Francis, who has something to show for the audience before and while you guys all prepare your responses to the question. So we heard a lot about examples from you, David, of what Quito is doing in terms of strengthening the food system. And Danny, you had a number of examples from around the world where you inspired us with the potential of what could happen. And so we're seeing from the questions in the audience are how, when we integrate urban farming more into our food system, how do we ensure that we are making sure that the benefits to the individuals and as food as medicine and creating those good jobs are accruing in the right ways? And also, when we do look at the cascading impacts of increasing climate pressures and others, how do we ensure that when we increase the ratio of urban farming and build that up in our cities, that that will be resilient in the case that we have either a drought or a typhoon or some other kind of cascading crisis that may come along? So I'll let you marinate on those questions, marinate it purposefully pun for this food crowd, and also on Sustainable Gastronomy Day. As I understand, today is the UN Day of Sustainable Gastronomy. So I hope everyone, either before or after this, is going to engage in sustainable gastronomy on this special day, and turn it over to Francis.
Thank you, Lauren. Let me quickly, speakers, ponder on your question, share some of the cartoons that we received for 2 days. Here's the first one. I guess I have to share the screen first. Here it is. First one showing there's, in fact, always a lot of food, but doesn't mean it reached the right people. And COVID has certainly been one of the reasons. It doesn't, certainly not the only reason. This is another cartoon reflection from some of our cartoonists. These are drawn by Cooper, who's part of the cartoon collection. All these cartoons are free for everybody to use as long as they reference the cities on the front line caption, which is at the bottom. So feel free to use these and other cartoons that were created for the program in any of your presentation at any time. Back to you, I don't know, Lauren, who would you like to start answering the question?
Who would like to go first? Any volunteers? Otherwise, we can go in the same order of the presentations. David, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I think that is a great question, and that is something that we are also working on here in Quito with regards to the urban farming program of the city. It has, well, I think that is one of the main programs that the city has to offer either to other cities, a great example, or and to set as an example of how through food production we can achieve social and economic inclusion, under a gender lens, and that such practice is worth making the effort to be expanded and amplified. In the case of City of Quito, from the 1.6 thousand farms that we have, 80% are being produced by women, most of them single mothers, and that many of and the ones that are married, they are gaining economic independence at the same time, and the program is making them less vulnerable or a little bit more resilient, either to face an emergency such as the pandemic or any other emergency. We have to take into account that the city of Quito is a multi-threat city. We are in a highly seismic risk zone. We have active volcanoes around us, and of course, climate change will certainly impact us. Is already impacting us and will impact us in a strong way. So this is a great way to leverage or reduce socioeconomic vulnerability, especially when we think about the risk formula, which is composed of hazards, either natural or man-made. on one side, and on the other end we have vulnerability. The first is the one that causes catastrophes. The second one is the one that allows us to withstand and recover faster. So urban farming is definitely a strategy that needs to be strengthened and amplified. What we are working on right now is to include urban farming as part of the land use plan of the city of Quito to allow people to farm in other different spaces and to design other additional incentives to do so. I think that is my answer so far.
And I can just add, I mean, I think this question of how we ensure benefits to individuals who are working to create and manage and promote urban farming is that, you know, it has to come from the grassroots. I think what we have seen over and over again is, you know, folks who are well-meaning come into communities and, you know, say, oh, you should start this project and here's what you need to do and this will solve your problems. And, you know, that's often not the case. I think these initiatives have to be community-led, community-driven, really grassroots for them to work. And, you know, if we're talking about the United States and how, you know, urban farming can impact underserved communities, you know, I want to go back to what Karen Washington has taught me from Rise and Root Farm. You know, she says that, you know, our communities, her communities of African American folks, they don't need help. What they need is investment. And I think it's that, you know, that is sort of a shift where in sort of the development and philanthropic world and, you know, resiliency world, I think a lot of us have this tendency to want to help. And that's often not what communities need. What they need is investment, and they need, you know, that security to be able to start and develop their own initiatives. And I think that's what can be a real game changer when we're not just talking about, you know, making cities more resilient to the shocks of climate change or, you know, demonstrations that may shut down a city for a few days or longer, or what COVID-19 has done. I think it's investing in those communities so that they can be, you know, self-sufficient, that they feel empowered and can do these things on their own.
And I'm going to give you the last response on this, Roy.
I don't have that much to say. I would just say urban farming, vertical farming, they all have a role to play, but there aren't silver bullets in this. This has got to be part of a system solution. You know, urban and vertical farming can be very helpful with, you know, meeting some of the micronutrient needs, but it's not going to, you know, you're not going to grow wheat or corn or many of these other staple crops. And you're going to need a complete system in place, but it can be very helpful and especially shortening supply chains, which I think are really really critical.
Thank you, everyone. The next question is really for Danny, but I suspect, Roy, that you'll also have some ideas on this topic. Danny, your presentation was really a call for action, right? We need to change the food system, but you mostly talked about grassroots movement, grassroots initiatives. You haven't mentioned much about the role of government, countries, states, cities, and the big question is, how do you bring scale in this change? So is anybody doing this right? Are there policies that government can try to implement? What would you suggest that government take over? And Roy, you probably have ideas on this as well. And David, if you want to jump in, feel free.
I mean, I think it's you know, not an understatement to say that the federal government here in the United States has not stepped up to the plate in supporting a lot of things during COVID-19, especially, you know, making the food system, you know, better. There have been lots of things that I think have not been done well. I think where we're seeing is where there's been a lack of federal commitment and federal action is that cities and towns and local governments, including, the institutions like school boards, are taking on these issues in a bigger way. I don't know how sustainable that is. I think the federal government has to step up to the plate. We need, things like a food and farm bill instead of just a farm bill. We need, to eliminate subsidies that promote unsustainable agriculture practices. We need better protections in place for workers at the federal level. We need better protections in place for farmers at the federal level. So all of these things, I think, they come from we need to be hitting these things at all levels. So there's a lot of grassroots change that I'm very inspired by. But I think what that will eventually do is trickle up and convince policymakers that they need to take action. I think this year, especially, and again, I'm talking about the United States, if our elected officials aren't talking about food and climate and the pandemic, then they're going to lose a lot of voters. So I think this is the year to really take on the the government. And if you do, I talked to one expert from the Overbrook Foundation who said, this pandemic, the most important thing we can do during this pandemic is vote, and vote for leaders who we believe will improve health policy and will improve food policy. So I think there's a lot being done. If there's not one example, there are just so many examples of what cities and communities are doing all over the country and all over the globe that, are building better composting pickup, or helping reduce waste in cities. There are all of these different measures that are taking place, but I think the federal governments and national governments really need to learn from those local state and city initiatives.
Yeah, and I would just double click on that. I mean, I think obviously government has huge influence on both the financial flows that need to change, not just the subsidies, but who gets money, who gets insurance, and it's so skewed and inequitable right now, and we need to shift that. I also think there's a huge role for regulation and policy, like simple things actually. Right now, we're working in Africa to just change the regulation for school meals from processed grain to whole grain. And it turns out it's actually cheaper for millers and no extra cost for governments, right? And yet it has a huge, important impact on health of children. There's lots of low-hanging fruit, no pun intended, to do these sorts of things that now that we can see it with I think better eyes.
And this is now my unfortunate responsibility to try to draw these conversations to a close, at least temporarily. There's a lot more that we could say about how to make the food system more resilient, but I think we've had a few really key and clear messages. Understanding where vulnerable communities are and also investing in them as part of the solution to this problem. Really incentivizing and calling out where we have healthy and protective foods available and getting them to our communities, and then also recognizing our ability to take collective action. When I think about just the members of the Global Resilient Cities Network represent about 250 million people, and then the massive additional outreach that we have through our friends at the World Bank and the many other networks that we're working with here, through Food Tanks Network, through the Rockefeller Foundation's network. There's an incredible ability for us to keep these messages going about these interconnected investments and changes to the system that can be made, and that, as you said, Roy, there are low-hanging fruit that can be picked, the seeds can be planted, and I think we can really grow that sustainable and resilient food system. So with that, I just really want to thank all of you again for making time. It's very early in the morning where Roy and David are, and it's early in the morning where Danny is, so thank you for getting up and spending your morning with us. And for all of those online, just to remind you, we'll be back here next week with Leah Bonnet, the Deputy Mayor of Barcelona, and we'll be talking about digital and green recovery. So I hope that you'll come back and be with us again. Thank you all so very much.